1965 and 66 were pivotal years in Cadillac history for a number of reasons, in part because the division was continuing to increase its sales year after year, producing record numbers of Cadillacs at its Clark Street facility. In fact, in 1962, Cadillac sold about 161,000 vehicles, all of which were produced at its Clark Avenue plant in Detroit. And by this point in 1965, Cadillac had undertaken the facility's largest expansion to date, which added about 500,000 square feet to the plant and was going to enable it to produce 800 cars a day with 10,000 employees working at the facility. As 1965 and 66 would come to a close, they again would be record sales years for Cadillac, where in 1965, Cadillac sold 181,000 vehicles, and in 1966, Cadillac sold just shy of 200,000 units at 197,000 cars. But the 1965 Cadillacs were pivotal for a number of reasons. The first is that these really were starting to become the last of the true standard of the world Cadillacs. Obviously, the division continued to produce vehicles for many years to come, but one might argue that the 65 and 6 Cadillacs really are the high water mark, perhaps in the whole marque's history, at least the modern history, if we forget about the V16s, V12s, etc. of the 1930s. More specifically, the 1965 and 6 Cadillacs really became the best of the mass-produced Cadillacs, let's say. Those V12 and V16 models really didn't sell hardly any units, but these, as I mentioned, were really great sellers, and there's a number of reasons as to why that was true. Now, you also have to put the 1965 Cadillac, the year that introduced this new styling, into context of what was happening at the time. While Cadillac sales were increasing year after year after year during this time, there was a vehicle that caught General Motors styling off guard yet again, really for the second time in a relatively short time frame. And that was the 1961 Lincoln Continental. The 61 Continental was such a departure from everything that Detroit was producing at the time. Remember, this was the age of tail fins as well as just overall outlandish styling. And the 61 Continental took that and really flipped it on its head with styling that was extremely restrained, tasteful, and frankly still looks elegant all these years later, while some of those fin cars look rather dated. I did just mention that this was the second time that General Motors stylists were caught off guard in a relatively short time period, because the 61 Continental came on the heels of the 1957 Chrysler lineup, which also really set General Motors styling back on its heels with jarringly beautiful cars with thin roof designs, big tail fins, well-sculpted overall forms and features on those vehicles compared to what GM was producing at the time and frankly released for the 1957 and 58 model year. Generally pudgy and doughy vehicles that in some cases, like the Oldsmobiles and the Buicks of 1958, were bedizened with so much chrome that, well, they just didn't look quite right. We'll spend another episode talking about some of those vehicles because they actually have also a very interesting history. But let's get back to the 65 to 66 Cadillac and talk a little bit about the styling themes for this vehicle, and we'll take a look at some early tape drawings as well as full-size clay models that show you where Cadillac was thinking of taking the styling direction for the 65 to 6 vehicles. And it actually, often these clay models display a styling direction that ended up being very different from the final production version for a number of reasons. Let's first take a look at some of these clay models and full-size airbrush renderings before going into more details about the vehicle itself. And here you have an early full-size airbrush rendering of the 1965 Cadillac. And notice a number of things. The first is take a look out back. You do see a vertical tail lamp that interestingly is bisected by what appears to be a piece of bright trim with the Cadillac logo. But remember that for 1964 and for a number of years prior, Cadillac had separate tail fins. Well, this car clearly doesn't have separate tail fins. This was a more, let's call it, understated approach to the Cadillac vertical tail lamp. Perhaps even arguably one of the most understated treatments going all the way back to when Cadillac introduced its vertical taillights in the 1948 model year. I also love how the top section of the deck lid tapers and kind of gradually comes down as the rear of the body sweeps upward for this beautiful tapered look at the rear, helping minimize the overall heft of that surface. You'll also notice that the tires have very thin white walls, particularly of the period. Remember, this was a time period where the thick white walls were generally employed to make the wheels look bigger. Here, this is a very thin white wall, kind of similar to what would be used in the 1966 Tornado. And the white wall isn't close to the wheel, so it's more of an accent as opposed to something to make the wheel look larger. Next, let's take a look at the doors, and you'll notice something obvious. This car has suicide doors. And remember, I was saying that this car was really Cadillac's response to the 1961 Continental. And I suppose one of the things that they were thinking of here is, well, the Continental had these suicide doors. We should do the same. Now, Cadillac had heritage with the suicide doors, including on the Eldorado Bromes. So my sense is perhaps they were just trying to reclaim their suicide door heritage with this particular proposal. Next, let's take a look at that formal D-line there with the vertical shape to the rear section of it. And that was really a cue that had been associated with luxury cars for a number of years. While this roofline isn't all that stiff and rigidly upright, it certainly has that upright profile as part of the daylight opening area or the window glass opening on the rear door. And that, I think, harkens back to days when people were chauffeured around in luxury vehicles. And so that helped provide an element of privacy for the rear seat passengers because people outside really couldn't see them. Next, take a look at that area of the front of the vehicle in front of the front wheel where there's some sort of a grille. I guess that grille is spilling over from the front of the car over to the side. That was something that clearly didn't make it onto the production version. There would be a cornering light there that was rather large, but this was an interesting proposal. And lastly, just take a look at the overall form of this 1965 Cadillac. The rear is such a contrast versus the 64 model with its mini tail fins, and an even larger contrast versus earlier model year Cadillacs that had a lot more body side sculpture. This is just simple, clean Bauhausian design, very similar to what was employed, or the styling that was employed on the 1961 Continental, and frankly also what Pontiac employed in their 1963 Grand Prix, which was their response to that Continental. Let's now transition to viewing an early full-size clay model. This would have been constructed after the full-size airbrush rendering that you saw before. And you'll notice the clean body side sections of the previous full-size airbrush, but there are a number of differences and some strange forms to this overall vehicle. Take a look at that front. It does have the typical Cadillac egg crate grille. It does have this kind of raised roof, if you will, hood profile that would basically be used as the deck lid on the 67 Eldorado, or at least a form similar to it. And even Ford would steal that on their 68 LTD for their hood. But look at those fenders and the headlights that are included and integrated into them, as well as a set of, I'm guessing, bright lights that are inboard of them in the grille. What a funky and, kind of strange look. I think overall, the forms of this vehicle could have worked for the Cadillacs, but if you look at this front three-quarter view and you imagine what the full side view would have looked like of this car, it doesn't necessarily read Cadillac, and that's my guess as to why this design proposal was rejected. And you notice here that tapering off of the deck lid is even more pronounced in the full-size airbrush rendering. And you don't have a lower skeg line, but on this vehicle you do have this pronounced feature line that's running all the way through the length of the car with a pretty pronounced, I would say, radius to it that appears to even get more pronounced as it moves toward the rear of the vehicle. Overall, I guess I would call it an interesting design, but I'm kind of happy that the designers ended up rejecting this one in favor of the production model. It just doesn't look quite right. Notice it doesn't have any door handles on this proposal, so perhaps Cadillac was just deciding what to do with the doors, whether they be suicide or normal doors. Now, where did they come up with this headlight theme, or where was Cadillac going with that? I'm not quite sure, but I can tell you that it was a theme that was being examined for more than just the Deville and soon to be the Calais series, which would replace the Series 62 as a lower end model in the Cadillac lineup. Take a look here at a rendering that was done by then Cadillac designer Wayne Cady for a two-door Eldorado, and you'll notice a very similar front end here. So Cadillac was examining that kind of a front end for its lineup, I think it's actually good that they ended up rejecting it and again going with the production design, both for the Eldorado, the 67 Eldorado, which is one of the high points of Cadillac design of all time, as well as the 65 full-size Cadillacs. Next, take a look at this proposal that has kind of a similar but slightly different front end. You still have those headlights integrated to the fenders and the inboard bright lights, but notice out back that feature that is starting about partly through the rear door that's continuing on through the rear end of the vehicle. That would not make it to production on the 65 and 6 Cadillacs, but something similar to that would make it to production for 1967. So perhaps it was shelved in favor of the more simpler design for the introductory years 1965 and 1966 before Cadillac designers brought that form back in 1967. This proposal also has 4 headlights, and I'm guessing what appears to be the turn signals inboard of the 4 headlights. Certainly a different shape to this one overall. Take a look at that biplane bumper up front. Of course, the typical Cadillac egg crate grille. And then you'll notice that form, again, starting partway through the rear door and continuing on in the back, more like a tail fin. That would, as I mentioned before, come back. Something similar to that would come back for 67. But here, this is almost like a 1964 style execution on this particular Clay model. Again, obviously, the production version looked much different than this. Now, as the design continued to evolve, the front end really was something that I guess the Cadillac designers were struggling with because it just kept changing. Take a look at this proposal, completely different from the last full-size Clay that I showed. Here you have exposed headlamps. You have the fender forms are similar to the other vehicles with the single headlights included in the fender. But you can see on the passenger side of the car, this turn signal area would actually end up resembling what was launched on Cadillacs for the 1969 and 70 model years. The driver's side has a different overall form, so the designers are trying to show 2 different proposals here for the turn signals. But again, this full-width grille with the headlamps in front of it was not something that the designers would end up going with. They would end up going with the stacked headlight theme for the car. And in this later model of what appears to be a pillared Fleetwood sedan, you can see that now designers have gone to a hidden headlight design, and the fender form is becoming more like what the final car would have, particularly the top of that fender. Now, where in the world did that shape come from, and what was the inspiration? Well, Wayne Cady, then a designer at Cadillac, later Cadillac's chief designer, told me that that fender form really came from GM styling vice president Bill Mitchell just not being happy with the front end of the vehicle. And after having a number of, let's say, fits about this particular form, ended up telling the designers to take inspiration from the grille of the Miller race car and make that the fender form. So here, take a look at the inset, which is a Miller race car radiator, and you can see it looks very, very similar, and the final production version would have a similar inspiration. This wouldn't be the only time that Bill Mitchell would talk to his designers, allegedly, about taking inspiration from that Miller race car. There's another vehicle whose not fender form, but grille took inspiration from that Miller race car. That is the 1969 Grand Prix. As time went on, the Clay models got increasingly close to the production look. Notice here the car now has stacked headlights, at least on the passenger side. The driver's side, it looks like the designers are experimenting with some form of a hidden headlight. But notice the top of that headlight area does still have that Miller race car radiator type form to it. Although here you have something that also didn't make it on the final car, this full-width grille that's divided in 2, though a similar theme would reemerge for 1966. And you still have that, let's call it a mini fin in the back, which also did not make it through to production. That would be toned down into more of a, I guess I'd call it a squeak as opposed to a fin on the final production version. And lastly, let's take a look at the rear of a proposal here. Take a look at those taillights. There are 2 different proposals, one on the driver's side. It's a little bit hard to see in this picture. Unfortunately, it's cropped. But on the passenger side, there's a different proposal closer to the final version. But you have the vertical taillights, or at least parking lights, and then you have supplemental lights that are wall-to-wall in the tail panel there as well. And it's a bit cluttered look, a bit heavy-handed. I think the final production version was much more graceful. Also, look at how low that fender skirt is on the rear wheel, or if there's even a skirt at all, and it's just kind of that rear fender form. Maybe there's a mini skirt there, but that rear wheel is certainly skirted on this. So kind of an interesting proposal from the back end as well. I guess the good news is, from my perspective, that the designers ended up cleaning up the overall final forms, and the 65 Cadillac that resulted was, I think, the best version of all those that you saw. Sometimes the pre-production clay models look better than the final version. In this case, I think the designers picked it right, and the final version is just absolutely stunning. You can see how clean the body side section is there. Not really a supplemental tail fin or a skeg line at the rear, just a clean, simple, beautiful surface on the side there. And the front end of these vehicles, with the first version of the double-stacked headlamps that Cadillac ever offered, I think just came out to be extremely tasteful. The egg crate grille texture just looks right for the car. And again, you see that Miller radiator race car form there, forming the top of the headlamp area. So that did make it through to production. Overall, just a stunning car from the front. Let's take a look at the rear, because the rear ended up being very tasteful and more sedate than the clay models. And if you look to the rear, you see that you kind of have, well, mini fins, but not really, on the top and the bottom of the tail lamp. I think this ended up being an overall tasteful treatment. There's no wall-to-wall tail lights to supplement the large vertical lamps. There's just kind of a decorative piece in that tail panel on either side of the license plate. These tail lights also, I think, look quite good. Interestingly, note that there are exposed screws on the top and the bottom of the lens in order to get the bulb out. During this period, Fisher Body was a bit reticent to allow owners to change the bulbs from the backside of the lens, i.e. in the trunk, because they thought it might contribute to potential water intrusion. So often the taillight bulbs in these cars were changed from the outside of the car. This really has an interesting anecdote associated with it when we go to 1966. And here's the 66 taillights, very similar to the 65s, which are in the inset, but indeed different, as is that decorative piece in the tail panel. Now, notice the 66 rear taillights, there are no exposed screws from the outside, and one might think, well, this is no big deal. Well, remember what I told you about there not being any accessibility to the taillights from inside the trunk on these vehicles. So there's no way to get at it from the trunk. There's no accessibility from the screws that would normally be on the outward side here of the lens. How do you change the bulb? Well, you either have to have a very small hand and be able to reach up in between the bumper area, or you're dropping the rear bumper on these vehicles to change the taillight. Yes, that is true. You can see here a sketch from Wayne Cady, who was a Cadillac designer at the time. This sketch is from January of 1964. And here's his proposal for the 66 taillight, which would actually make it through to production. Notice the sketch purposefully doesn't have any exterior screws in it because Wayne didn't want those to be visible. He thought that it impinged on the design. Well, Wayne was a very young designer at this point and maybe wasn't thinking about serviceability. And when I've previously asked him about instances of design that he regrets, this is one of those that comes to his mind just for the reasons that I articulated. It's a beautiful taillight. It's just very hard to service. Now, the styling, though, was probably what really helped these Cadillacs set new sales records for 1965 and 66. As I previously mentioned, 1965, the division sold about 180,000 plus cars. 1966, they sold about 200,000. And they did it across 11 different models. The one big change year over year versus the 64s was that the Series 62 nameplate was sunset. It was now called the Calais, which you see here. And by the way, the Calais are often my favorite because they don't have the vinyl roof. This one in particular, I think, is just an extremely handsome two-door Calais coupe, in part for that reason. The Calais was about $400 cheaper than the Deville. You can multiply by 10-ish for roughly those figures today. So you save $4,000 buying the Calais. And you got most of the Cadillac creature comforts, but a cheaper interior and, well, some different trim. Of course, the volume leader was the Deville series, and that had a base price of about $5,600-ish, so about $55,000-ish today. The Calais, as I mentioned, was $400 cheaper than the Deville. And then you had the more specialty models like the Eldorado. This would be the rear-wheel drive Eldorado, which was a convertible. the Fleetwood 60 Special four-door sedan, and the Fleetwood 75 limousine for 1965 Cadillac production. All of these models were on an all-new chassis, which had a new box section perimeter frame, and that consequently enabled moving the engine forward in the car, reducing the size of the transmission tunnel, helping overall interior room and comfort. It also gave the car a better center of gravity, and it was just an overall better frame than really what was used on the previous generation. These Devilles and Calais and Eldorados also weighed a bit less than their predecessor, in part because of the frame. The only car that retained the previous generation frame was the Fleetwood 75, which had its X-frame and a two-piece drive shaft, still for the 1965 model year. Under hood of these 1965 Cadillacs was a familiar engine, the 429 cubic inch Cadillac V8 that made 340 horsepower and 480 pound-feet of torque. This engine would be produced by Cadillac through the 1967 model year, when it would be replaced in 1968 with the all-new 472 cubic inch Cadillac V8. The 429 was overall a pretty good engine. It was basically a bored and stroked 390 engine that Cadillac had produced until that 1964 model year when the 429 was introduced. Like I said, the 429 was pretty good. I've driven, and I have a 429 in my 67 Eldorado. Very smooth engine, quite peppy. They did have some challenges with the oil pump and the timing cover in some cases, where the oil pump might wear into the timing cover and thus cause you to lose oil pressure. I haven't had that in my particular vehicle. Of course, it's low mileage, and I change the oil frequently, but if you didn't and you had higher mileage, that was an issue for some folks. And of course, Cadillacs of this era were outfitted with GM's excellent turbohydromatic 400 transmission that in these years had a variable pitch stator, had a two-position variable pitch stator, which meant that the stall speed varied depending upon your throttle application. So if you had normal throttle application, I would say up to about 2/3 throttle, the car had a lower stall speed, or the transmission stator blades were arranged such that it had a lower stall speed. And then if you floored it or pushed past that, 2/3-ish throttle, you would then increase the stall speed of the transmission by the stator blades changing their pitch. And consequently, you had a bit more oomph. It was a great idea, these switch pitch transmissions. It was used on the turbohydromatic 400, the Dynaflows, and some other applications for GM. It really was just sunset because of cost in the late 1960s, but it was quite durable and worked very, very well. I should also mention that the stator would be in the higher stall speed at idle, and that was supposedly to help minimize creep at stoplights when you took your foot off the brake. Kind of goofy, but I suppose it worked. It was an overall very, very good system. And I would say that this setup worked quite well for Cadillacs overall. Various road tests at the time suggested these vehicles could perform 0 to 60 in about 9-ish seconds, a little over 9 seconds. And for a 4,800-pound plus car, that is really quite good. And they did so silently, and part of that silence was due to a new coaxial resonator exhaust that was allegedly sonically balanced. I've driven one of these 65 Cadillacs with the stock exhaust, and my Eldorado has a stock exhaust, and I will say that it is indeed very, very quiet. So you don't hardly hear the engine running, and you don't hear any exhaust noise either. These were, of course, large cars, and I mentioned the 4,800-pound plus weight. They rode atop a 129.5-inch wheelbase if you bought a Calais, a Deville, or an Eldorado. If you got a Fleetwood 60 Special, then it rode atop a 133-inch wheelbase, and the Fleetwood 75s rode atop an almost 150-inch wheelbase. So pretty large vehicles, although the length would be surpassed by the big bumper cars in the Cadillacs of the mid-1970s. Let's transition now to the interior of these 1965 and 6 Cadillacs. I think they're some of the most handsome interiors that Cadillac ever put together. First, let me just say that everything was really optional in these years, even power windows, power locks, air conditioning for Cadillacs. So this is a manual window car, both the vent window as well as the normal window. And that wasn't that typical for Cadillacs during this period, but some of them had that. So you could get tons of creature comforts in these. Cruise control, automatic climate control, which was introduced in 1964 in Cadillacs and continued on through 65 and 66. 3-position wipers, power windows, power seats, power locks, tilt telescoping wheel, just a whole host of goodies, automatic headlamp dimmer, automatic headlamp turn on or twilight sentinel. So there was a lot of content that you could get in these Cadillacs. Now, take a look at the theme of this instrument panel, how it wraps into the door. This is one of the cars where that was happening relatively early here. That would be something that would come back into vogue in the 90s and the 2000s, but it was pretty atypical during this time frame to have the IP theme wrap into the door because it was hard to execute with all of these different pieces trying to line up. But here Cadillac did it, and I think they did it absolutely beautifully. And here's a 66 interior, again, very similar to what I was mentioning on the 65. I love the horizontal speedometer that's flanked by the 2 round dials. One is the headlamp control, the other is the clock. Then, of course, you have the temperature gauge, the fuel gauge, the shift quadrant in the middle area there beneath the speedometer. So functional layout, looks great, and is just absolutely beautiful. Cadillac interiors would really start going downhill, I would say, 1968, 1969, and would never really reach this level ever again, frankly. I think the 65 and 6 have some of the most tasteful, understated, and beautiful interiors ever put in a Cadillac. They're just wonderful pieces of art to look at. Now then, what were the changes for the 1966 model year? We already talked about the rear tail lamp treatment, and that was different, and some of the decorative pieces on the deck lid and rear area. But on the front, the car's got a new grille with a different egg crate grille texture pattern, and the grille now had this center bar theme, as you see here, with the parking lights incorporated into the ends of the center bar as opposed to being in the bumper. The bumper was also redesigned to better incorporate the license plate from the 1965 version, and I think it overall was, well, I actually like the 65 a little bit better, but the 66 is also a handsome vehicle. The front end was also de-chromed pretty significantly for 66. There were no longer any fender peak moldings that the 65s had. The cornering light was redesigned and was now surrounded by sheet metal and didn't extend all the way down to the front bumper. The 65s had a piece of bright work that was separating the front fender from the cornering lamp up front, and that was gone. I think that was something that I really missed on the front end of the 66s as opposed to the 65s. The other element that was changed for 66 is that the Fleetwood Brougham was no longer just a trim option. It actually was a new model. So the Cadillac model count for 1966 had reached 12 as opposed to 11. And the Fleetwood 75s finally had the new Cadillac styling and caught up with their Calais, Deville, Eldorado brethren. Overall, the 65 and 6 Cadillacs are just beautiful machines, and really Cadillac's response to the 61 Continental, and a successful response at that. It's unfortunate that after this, Cadillac would start going downhill in some areas, particularly the interiors of their vehicles. They just never were quite as rich as they were on the 65s and 6s, though some of the exterior styling remained quite captivating. Regardless, the 65 and 6s are some great vehicles to own. Thanks again for watching.